welcome to our special report, Doing Business in the USA. The welcome lamp is lit again. This is brought to you by my organization, the Talk Show Factory News Network. This is part one of a two-part series. We produce panel discussions like these and TV shows focusing on business, finance, tax, the economy, divorce, real estate, and entertainment. Today, we're focusing on the global economy and the impact of recent developments on companies entering the United States. My name is Bruce Stout, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. During this program, I'm going to ask the panelists a series of questions, and at the end, I'm going to open up the program to questions by our participants and our attendees. Let me start this by first asking our participants to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Fernando Koatz.
Thank you. Good morning, Bruce. My name is Fernando Koatz. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Gleason & Koatz located in Midtown Manhattan.
Thank you. And next, Josh Goldberg.
Good morning, Bruce. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Bruce said, I'm Josh Goldberg. I'm a partner at the firm of Nath, Goldberg & Meyer. We are intellectual property attorneys based in Alexandria, Virginia.
Okay, and next we have Robert Walker.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Good morning, fellow panelists, attendees. My name is Bob Walker. I run a company called Surveys and Forecasts. We are a company that focuses on helping clients understand their customers, their competitors, their markets, and advise on companies who are interested in entering the U.S.
Okay, and finally, we have, last but not least, we have Alan Tepper.
Thank you, Bruce. My name, as Bruce said, is Alan Tepper. I'm a co-founder of a consulting firm called CFO Consulting Partners. I'm actually starting to go by the name Fractional CFO Alan. But what are we? We're a fractional CFO and consulting firm that provides a suite of C-level consulting services to small and mid-sized companies.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to start our panel discussion with Fernando this morning. Fernando, in your experience, what are many of the companies, where are they coming from? Where are they originating as they're entering the U.S.?
Well, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis of the Department of Labor, in 2019, foreign direct investment to acquire, establish, or expand U.S. businesses mainly came from the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and Japan. And as a region, Europe probably comprised more than 50% of that foreign direct investment, and where they went into, and it was for more than $194 billion in 2019, which was actually down for 2018. I haven't seen the statistics for 2020, where they invested mostly were the states of California, Pennsylvania, and Texas, and principally in manufacturing, transportation, and warehousing. Now, I deal mostly with Latin America and Spain, so there is foreign and direct investment from there, but that's not the bulk of what's coming into this country.
Fernando, if I can just interrupt for a second, your video feed is cut. So I'm going to come back to you after you got your feed working. Josh, I'm going to move on to you then, and we'll come back to Fernando. First of all, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Bruce.
Okay, and so what are the concerns of which companies entering the U.S. should be aware regarding their intellectual property assets?
Sure, that's a great question, Bruce. And we deal with a lot of companies coming in from overseas. What a lot of people, a lot of companies don't realize is whatever protections they have, be it a patent for their new invention, a trademark for the company name or the product name or their logo, copyright for their written materials, those rights tend to be geographic in nature. So for example, if you're a company from Germany, say, and you get rights in Germany, your rights are going to be limited to Germany. If you come here to the US, unless you separately apply for and get those rights, you're entering an unprotected market. So if you don't realize that, and if you don't pay attention ahead of time, you might find that you think, okay, well, I have a patented product, nobody else can compete with me, so I can charge a premium. Well, that might not be the case here in the US because you have not gotten your patent rights here. So suddenly you have a lot of competition that's going to be a lot cheaper than you possibly, and the sales you were expecting to get, the markets you were expecting to have, dry up or were greatly reduced. So that's something you really need to focus on.
Okay, so what are the patent opportunities that they can register for in the US that may not be applicable in other countries?
Sure. So like I said, everything is geographic. So if you get a US patent, of course, that's not applicable in any other country. It's a US patent good only here. Same thing for Australia, Japan, China, the European Union, wherever. Everything's going to be different. Not only that, because you're dealing with independent countries with their own national laws, just because you get a patent here in the US and it's good here does not necessarily mean you're going to be able to do the same in another country. For example, you can get a software patent maybe in Japan if what you have is software. Software is more difficult to get here in the US to get it protected. Vice versa, if you have like a pharmaceutical product, a new chemical or a new biological, often it's easier to get that protected here than it would be in other countries just because of our national laws. So you really need to work with an expert depending on where you're planning on doing business to say, see what's possible. You know, what can I do in this country? What can I protect and how can I protect it? So you're not surprised before it's too late.
Okay. You know, there's been a lot of talk about intellectual property theft from other countries stealing US intellectual property. Let me just turn the tables for a minute and say, how do foreign companies coming into the US, how do they protect themselves from US companies ripping off their intellectual property?
Well, there are a few different ways. Number one, of course, you have to protect yourself, get your rights granted here in the US. And unlike in some other countries, the US Patent Office, US court systems tends to be blind as to whether you're a US company or a foreign company. Now, of course, if you're suing, say, in the Eastern District of Virginia, and one of the parties is a Virginia entity, of course, the court is likely to pay a little more attention to that local boy. But if you're dealing with something countrywide versus external, it really doesn't matter. You're treated the same way. So that's a really good thing. The other thing is, depending on what you're doing, if you have actual product, that has to come into the US somehow, unless you're manufacturing here. And we've done many times a lot of work with Customs and Border Patrol, where we educate them that, hey, we think gray market, black market goods are coming into the US. We put together a manual, a playbook for them, right? Here's what you need to be on the lookout for. Here's the products that we think are coming in. Here's the rights that our client has. If you see anything that doesn't have this patent stamp on it or doesn't look to have this name on it, but looks to be the same goods, stop it and let us know, let our clients know so that we can tell you, yes, this should come in, no, this should not. Those I would think would be some of the key ways that you have to look at and prevent competition here in the US, regardless if you're a US company or a foreign company. And then the last thing I would say, and again, this applies to any company, be on the lookout, right? Don't just sit on your laurels and wait for things to come to you. Have people out there in the marketplace looking to see, is anybody competing with us? Do your online searches and due diligence and stay on top of it. I think my friend Bob Walker here, who is going to be talking shortly, is somebody who can help with those surveys and keeping track of information, things like that. So he would be a perfect example of somebody who can help you monitor what's going on, see what trends are out there, and maybe there is theft happening that you're not aware of.
Okay. So is there real or perceived protectionism by the US Patent Office regarding foreign versus US company applications?
There really isn't. The only time there's protectionism, and this applies not just to foreign entities, but US entities also, is if there is a technology area that is important to national defense. Think of a new bomb or new missile, something like that. Regardless of where the company is from, the patent office might put it into a black box, make it not available to the public because it's seen as something that is contrary to the defense of the nation. But again, that's not a foreign versus US issue or an international versus US issue. It applies to anybody. The government, the patent office just does not want that information out there, period. There is no protectionism whatsoever. And I'd say over the course of my career, probably slightly more than half of the cases I've worked on have originated outside of the US, maybe 55%, something like that. I've never once seen anything that I would view as protectionism.
Okay, that's good to know. That's comforting for offshore companies entering the US, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what else would you like to add?
So what I would like to add is, as we've seen during the past year, during the pandemic and with everything that's happened in COVID, it really is an interconnected world. And it's incredibly difficult to isolate one area, one region from the rest of the world. I know there's always talk that we need to manufacture more here to prevent some of these supply chain issues we've seen. We need to do this and that, and those are all good goals. That doesn't stop anything from any foreign investment or foreign entry into the US. All it means is we want to do more on premises. If you think of, for example, Toyota or Honda, most of the vehicles that they sell in the US are manufactured here in the US. Does that make them still a foreign company with foreign sales? Or does that just make them an interconnected company, multinational company where, the ownership of the company might be elsewhere, but they're really investing here in the US, doing good things for the people in the US and enjoying the benefits of it. And I would say the intellectual property laws we have here in the US really help with that. Whatever you do here in this country, whether manufacture here, have services here, import into here, those are all ways that you can protect what you're doing. So I wouldn't worry so much about protectionism. I would really be focused on what's the size of the market, what's the size of the opportunity, and how do we capitalize on it?
Okay, that's great information. I should mention, by the way, that everybody that's registered for this program will receive a video, and the contact information for all of our panelists will be on that. But in the meantime, Josh, how can people reach you?
Well, I'm always available by email at jgoldberg@nathlaw.com. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn as Joshua Goldberg, and my office phone number is 703-548-6284.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Fernando, I'm going to go back to you. What are some of the specific legal challenges that companies coming into the U.S. have to deal with?
Well, thank you again, Bruce. Sorry about that before that I was frozen, literally. Anyway, there's some of the legal challenges that are confronted by foreign companies that come into the U.S. are, for example, product liability claims. If they sell a product and there's an accident resulting from negligence or some kind of misconduct, they'll have to deal with that situation. Another form of litigation they face are breach of contract disputes. Those are unfortunately quite common. Employee issues, someone who's claiming that they've been discriminated against or haven't been paid well enough. Another thing that they have to deal with are federal, state, and city agencies. And of course, and I was going to say this before Joshua started speaking, intellectual property, which is something they don't focus on a lot. And it becomes a big issue if they haven't taken care of it before coming or planning it well enough to come into the United States.
So what are some of the regulations that they're likely to run afoul of without even really knowing it and not, getting really legal sound advice?
Well, the regulations, they're myriad. There are banking regulations about how money comes into this country, and KYC and AML. There are credit regulations if they're offering some kind of credit with respect to the purchasers. There are import-export regulations that apply. Visas with respect to not being properly counseled by an immigration lawyer, taxes galore, internet issues on the websites with what they're saying and what they're offering that could run afoul of some kind of regulations along those lines, and anything involving licenses and franchises. All these things put together can become a welter of issues if it's not planned properly.
In your opinion, is this a good time for offshore companies to be coming into the U.S.?
Well, I think the thing, and this is because I deal a lot more with Latin America, is that The U.S. is always a good market because we have certainty with respect to legal and regulatory matters. In other words, whatever instability we may perceive to have here politically, economically, there is a perception abroad, especially in places like Latin America, that if you enter to a deal, if there's a contract or whatever, that someone can't flip the switch on you, so to speak, or make a change suddenly, and that you would be left unprotected. That is the best thing that U.S. has to offer, as being safe, relatively speaking. So yes, I think it is a good time for offshore companies to come in.
Okay, you were on our real estate panel last week, and we were talking about the glut of office space on the market. As companies enter the U.S. and they're coming into New York, are they going to be able to cut some really great deals regarding lease space?
Well, that's a whole nother discussion, but I think New York will come back, but only 80% as opposed to 100%. So yes, there'll be a lot of office space. If you want that, for example, you can cut some good deals. But if you're looking for warehouse or industrial property, that's a lot tougher because that market, in fact, got a lot more dearer with the pandemic.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, why is that?
Because companies like Amazon and Best Buy and so forth are buying up all these properties for distribution. So anyone wants to come in and import their products, putting aside issues of import, export, and customs and product liability, they want a place where they can put it there. And it's a lot more expensive now.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. What else would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to say, and I say this in another context when I talk about real estate with foreign buyers coming here and so forth, you need a team, and that team is composed of the CPA, the insurance broker, the real estate broker, the business consultant, and lawyers, immigration, and intellectual property. No one lawyer can or should be able to take on everything. I work with a lot of people, and that's the best for the team. It may seem more expensive at the beginning, but it's something in the long run will protect the foreign investor.
Good. Thanks very much. How can people reach you?
The best thing is by email, fkoatz@gleasoncoatz.com. I'm also available, just like Josh, on LinkedIn, and my office number is 212-986-1544.
Thanks very much. Alan, I'm going to move on to you. You're our principal in a fractional CFO firm, and you've probably got some great advice for companies entering the U.S. So welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Bruce.
So let's start with the banking question. Okay. What are the hurdles that companies entering the U.S. face regarding opening bank accounts and creating U.S. banking relationships?
Well, let me just mention two important ones that come to mind. One is banks follow the principle of KYC, which really stands for Know Your Customer. So banks are going to ask any company trying to come in, trying to open a bank account, for their articles of incorporation, ownership documents, board resolutions, employer identification number, and other things. But in the end, having all those doesn't even guarantee you'll get a bank account opened. So banks will look at customers on a case-by-case basis. But generally, if you have those and you're a company in good standing, you should be able to open a bank account.
Okay.
The second one is fear of not knowing. These foreign companies come in, and there's fear of knowing the U.S. banking system or banking regulations or culture. And so having someone who knows the U.S. banking system and knows the U.S. culture, I think could help reduce that fear level on the part of that person trying to open a bank account. But from a bottom line perspective, I think it's absolutely essential that bank accounts be established. I think that's obvious. But they need to be addressed very early in the process. And if you can have someone, if a company could have someone, or an executive of a company can have someone helping them that knows the U.S. banking system, knows the U.S. culture, I think that could help.
Okay, good to know. Can you explain the income tax impact on companies entering the U.S.? I mean, for example, do they have to pay both U.S. and foreign taxes?
Well, when we get to the taxes, I think the overriding principle that I'm going to say is it gets complicated very, very quickly. There's tax treaties. There are different ways of setting up your company, which could have different tax implications. So I think it's real important to talk to a tax professional who's going to guide you through those type of questions.
Yeah, I used to be a international tax consultant as a CPA, and I remember this is going back into the 80s and 90s, and we had controlled foreign corporations and discs and foreign tax credits to deal with. And
Right.
yeah, you're right, it got really complex really fast.
Yep.
Okay, so how hard is it for companies entering the U.S. to understand U.S. financial statements when the standards in their native countries are different?
Well, it may not be that hard because, so if you're coming from a company, say in, just pick a country, say France, and you're coming and France is opening a business in the US, what you're generally going to be reporting from a financial statement perspective back to France are the way France looks at their numbers, or the way the management in that particular company looks at the numbers. So whether you're domestically located in France or located in the US, you're generally going to be compiling the numbers in about the same way. The look and feel will be about the same way. So there really shouldn't be that much difference. On the other hand, if the US entity needs to be audited or reviewed, and they have to follow US GAAP principles, that may be different from the foreign country. And that may cause, that may be a little bit more difficult for an expat that's doing business here, that's living in the US, to kind of understand those numbers. Again, it's real important to talk to bring in an outside consultant who could help one go through those particular financial statements.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked the other panelists. Is this a good time for foreign companies to come into the US?
I think it's a terrific time on the curve. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand that's going to get released over the next few months or in the next couple of years. So I think if I were a foreign company looking to do something in the US, I would say between now and the next 6 months, I would be looking to do something in the US and start to get going.
So you agree the welcome lamp is lit then?
Yes, absolutely.
What else would you like to add?
Let's see. I just would like to say that, as I said just a moment ago, there's a lot of dry powder. This is a great place to do business at this point.
Okay, good to hear. And how can people reach you?
They can reach me by going to, they can go easily to our website and look under my name, Alan Tepper. You can email me at Tepper, that's ATEPPER, at cfoconsultingpartners.com, or look me up on LinkedIn. You'll find me.
Okay, good to know. Bob, I'm going to turn to you.
Okay.
Okay, so how difficult? It's your turn. You're on the hot seat.
Go fire away.
All right. So how difficult is it for offshore companies to establish a market in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's such a loaded question. I think I'll answer it on a couple of levels. One is, if you're a brand that's well known in your home country, let's pick a country, France, and let's assume that there's a region in the United States that's heavily populated with French nationals, and you take your French product from France and introduce it into the U.S., into an area that's largely French-speaking, French culture, etc., then the barriers are probably relatively low. I mean, it's a brand that people are aware of. They're familiar with how it's used. They're familiar with all of the benefits. They're familiar with all of the things that you could use it for. So if the population that's going to be receiving the product into their market is already generally aware and familiar, then a foreign country probably will have a relatively easy go of it. If it's something that's totally new in a totally different category, hasn't generated any familiarity in our market or markets or regions, then it may be a much more complicated process, in which case you're going to need to do quite a bit of homework before you decide to launch your product. So it's a bit of a, you know, like how much does a car cost, right? So it depends on whether you want a luxury car or an economy car. I think for some companies, if they have some amount of infrastructure already here, you know, to Josh and Fernando's and to Alan's comments about companies that have a you know, a broad international footprint, and they already have some manufacturing capability or pilot plant production capability in the United States, that helps enormously, because then they don't have to look for R&D or product development help. They don't have to look for distribution help or co-packing help or other kinds of resources, because some of those relationships already exist here. If they're coming in literally cold turkey and are really trying to find their way for the first time in the United States, then it's really quite daunting, because then they have to figure out all of the elements of the markets they want to go into. They need to understand all of the legal, regulatory, IP, financial aspects of their business. They need to understand all of the elements of their marketing mix. You know, product, price, place, promotion, all of those things have to be sorted out. So it is a continuum. If the prospective consumer is aware of the product or the category, is familiar, has some experience, then on the receiving end, the customer side, it becomes a lot less daunting, because the jump from education, you know, from awareness to education to consideration to ultimately purchase, that whole process is compressed. But in other cases, it may be quite complicated, in which case you would need a team of experts and advisors to try to help navigate those waters and help the company, you know, find its way in the U.S. market. So a long-winded way of saying it depends, but generally, you know, it is obviously achievable. Many companies want to try every year. But the companies that have some experience in the U.S., or there's a market already established, if you will, based on awareness, both of those things help quite a bit.
Culture has to play a major role in this.
Yes.
Can you address that a little bit?
Culture is huge. It kind of dovetails into what I was just talking about. You know, culture, language, usage, competitive set, all of those things are huge. I just finished a study for a company in, speaking of France, or to say it properly, France, that wants to introduce a nutritional supplement product here in the US, and I helped them develop their communications for that product. And they wanted to use benefits like it's not addictive, or they wanted to describe the product as coming in a sachet. Well, those are not words that typically American consumers would respond well to. They would respond well to the words non-habit forming, or they would probably respond well to a packet of product as opposed to a sachet of product. Those are just simple examples. Mm-hmm. And then you want to be careful that you're not going to be either inappropriate or culturally insensitive. I mean, if in a European country, you have an ad campaign that's risque and perhaps is perceived as maybe not particularly, not unfriendly to women, but let's say they portray women in a less than holistic way, and you try to bring that kind of communication to the United States, you're going to get slammed. You're going to get canceled, as they say. So you have to be very aware of the tone of not just the core message, but the tone, the language, the context, the usage occasions, all of those things have to be really well thought through, because you're not going to get a second shot at this. You got to get it right and right out of the gate. And if you're off strategy, if your communications is quirky or interpreted in a potentially offensive way, you can not only not do well, you can cause a lot of negative perceptions of your product. So you need to be very aware of how you're doing it, the manner in which you're doing it, and making sure that the target that you're reaching is getting the core message. So all of those things have to be thought through carefully. And there is, in an industrial products category, maybe it's not as essential, but you still have to be sensitive to those things. But in the consumer world, you got to be totally on top of all of that.
We manage a cross-border servicing team of which you're part. We're companies coming into the U.S. We have the accountants, the attorneys, other people.
Yep.
And with that said, I sometimes refer to you as the insurance policy for companies coming into the U.S. And what I mean by that is one of the things that you do and they really need to do is evaluate the market potential in the U.S. And so that's the insurance. Many companies I know, they come into the U.S., they set up a subsidiary, and they fail within a very short period of time. And companies pull them back, come back to Helsinki or come back to Paris, whatever.
Yep.
Okay, so how do you do that? How do you assess the market potential for a company coming into the U.S.?
Well, there are a few components to that. Let's take a consumer product, for example. We could do it for industrial or other kinds of categories, but you have to come up with some estimate of what the size of the potential market is. So either households that have bought the category in the past 12 months or bought a particular brand in the past 12 months, whatever it happens to be, and then begin to work from there. So how big is the pie? Will your product grow the pie, or are you just stealing share from other brands? If you're going to compete within the existing pie, then you need to figure out who the competitive set is you're going to go up against. Or if you're a premium product, you need to think about, okay, what are the other premium brands in the category? How do I want to price my product relative to those other premium brands? If you're going to go more for the mid-market or discount end of the market, how low do you want to go? Do you want to is it a race to the bottom? Do you want to, price your product super, super low with super thin margins and think about, the overall offering relative to the market? So the first thing is figuring out the size of the market, then figuring out what segments within that market you want to go after, then thinking about what kinds of communication, messaging, positioning, language, and to your question, Bruce, earlier about culture, trying to make sure that you're sorting through all of those issues first, and then from an execution standpoint, then you let's again assume it's some sort of a consumer product, whether it's a packaged goods product or a home appliance or whatever it happens to be. Making sure that your product is delivering against whatever promises you're making, so that there's what we in the marketing and research world would call the fit between the concept or the promise and the delivery of the product or service. So making sure that those two things are tightly integrated. So you don't want to either under-promise and over-deliver or over-promise and under-deliver. You want to make sure that those things are tightly integrated. So we would do some research, some custom work to try to determine whether or not that's an issue or whether you've got it right, and then try to figure out from there where you want to go in terms of markets. In other words, whether you want to start with a test market, or a small regional market, a semi-national or national market. We all know that speed to market is basically a strategic advantage. So we want to make sure, if we got it right, and people are responding well, and the company's large enough, because you're going to need some media spending behind this. If the company's large enough, then you might think about doing something like a national rollout. If, for example, the company has some footprint here, distribution, brokered sales force, or direct sales force, thinking about all those pieces, right? So all of those elements of the marketing mix have to work together. But it would all start with a forecast of some kind. So if the company comes in, we've got this product, we think it's great, we need to have it do $40 million in annual sales in year one. We can get really close to coming up with a accurate. We can come up with an accurate projection. We can come up really close to what they'll ultimately achieve if all of those elements I mentioned are right. The product is right, the messaging is right, the advertising is compelling, the pricing is right, the distribution is broad. So all of those things can be all of those things can be predicted, forecasted with a high degree of accuracy. So, you know, that's sort of the process we would use. It depends a little bit on the category and obviously on the product, but it all starts with how big is the market, and then figuring out how you can penetrate that market and capture share.
Got it. Okay. So are there particular industry verticals that are more likely to succeed these days than others?
Well, I think to some of the comments Josh was making earlier, I think you know, anything that is borderless, you know, SaaS products, software, things that are, you know, are not from a financial standpoint, but are easily you know, transferred from one to the next in terms of geography, stand a very good chance of succeeding if the product is compelling. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example in the software space. I mean, Canva comes to mind. That's an Australian-based software company, taken off like a rocket ship. Everybody's doing all of their design work on Canva. That's a company that was, you know, started in Australia. But if you've got a consumer product, an appliance, a fashion, anything that's kind of trending or trendy, there are lots of ways to stimulate interest and demand. I mean, I didn't even mention social media, but you know, that's an enormous influencer in terms of getting people to become aware, developing a hunger or thirst for whatever it is, and getting people interested in buying whatever that, you know, product or service is. And you know, influencers and Instagram and Facebook influencers in particular are very powerful. So there are a lot of things that can lead the way. You know, if there's a lot of buzz that's happening and it's not yet here, you know, you're kind of smoothing the path for when it does arrive and the demand is already there, the floodgates open, you've got a business. So I don't think it's necessarily limited to any particular type of product, but I do think, you know, software, gaming, things that just don't really respect borders are obviously well positioned. I think products that have some heritage in the home country and there's a large enough market here to absorb that is another. But I think you know, other than tax and legal regulatory obstacles, I don't really see that there's any one specific category that wouldn't be a good opportunity for a foreign company entering the U.S.
Okay, thanks. What else would you like to add?
What would I like to add? Well, I'd be happy at no charge. I'd be happy to chat with anyone who is contemplating something along the lines of what our panel has been talking about this morning. You know, I don't charge for consultation. I'd be interested in learning about what an entrepreneur or a company is maybe thinking about introducing in the U.S. And then the other sort of general comment would be, you know, it all boils down to risk. I think, Bruce, really at the end of the day, I mean, if as the company gets bigger, as the business opportunity gets larger, so do the risks. And so, you know, if you're selling hot dogs on the corner, you know, that the risk is you lose your hot dog stand. If you're selling, you know, 1 billion widgets, chances are if you screw that up, you're going to put a lot of people out of work. So I think companies ought to set aside a certain amount of their marketing and sales budget for understanding customers, customer needs, understanding what the market looks like, what the risks are. Because if you're informed, you can be prepared. And I think that's sort of the key message is do your homework. Don't assume that you know.
How do people reach you?
You can use a flare if you're nearby. I look up in the sky occasionally. That's number one. You can look up my name, Robert W. Walker. I'm on LinkedIn. And rww at SAF, that's Sam Apple Frank LLC.com.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to mention to everybody that each one of our panelists is a member of our subject matter experts agency. We own an agency that markets experts in a whole variety of fields. And so if you happen to be interested in being represented by an agency helping you get business, you can reach us. You can reach me at bstout, bstout at rainmakersforum.com. I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and actually, I'm going to start with one. Fernando, uh, tell us about where you've had issues with companies coming into the U.S. and they came to you and they already had some issue that they shouldn't have had, that you had to put the fire out of. What would that look like?
Well, I want to talk about first the thing that Alan mentioned briefly. One of the biggest issues I've had is trying to establish a bank account here. It is a big deal, especially because of the pandemic. And there's some bankers who will use Zoom to interview somebody to see who they are for their know your customer and anti-money laundering. And I'm participating in that meeting also because they know me and therefore I introduce them to these people. That's a pretty big issue these days, especially, again, I hate to say it because I'm from Latin America originally, for companies coming from Latin America. There's always this thing running around about people believing in money laundering. It's happening willy-nilly, what is not really true. But it happens, but not as much as people believe. With respect to existing problems, one of the biggest problems I see, and I'm not an employment lawyer, but it arises from employment issues. They have brought in somebody who's American, and there's a big disconnect there culturally or whatever, and there's an issue about how much they should be paid, and whether or not they even have an agreement with respect to that person. If they don't, at that point, I can help out on a basic agreement. But if it becomes a little more tawdry, if you will, or really complicated, I say, please, as part of that team I talk about, an employer lawyer. Related to that is the whole concept of NDAs and confidentiality. You're coming in from another country and you believe that what you have is unique and different, and it probably is to a great extent. Then you want to protect that, but it's not addressed initially. And a lot of people know about confidentiality, but they don't take care of it. There's a certain amount, and I hate to say this because it happens with any kind of industry or professional, sloppiness there. They'll go in there and start doing things without having done all the proper legwork. So those are some of the issues I've had to deal with.
Well, that's a big deal. Josh, let me ask you a question. A U.S. company comes to you and says, there's a company in China that's directly ripped off our product. What do you do?
Well, that's an interesting question, Bruce. It's actually one that I have real world experience with. And the first question I always ask is, when you say ripped off, where is that happening? Is it happening here in the US? Is it happening here in China? Because the answer is going to be very different depending on the location. Here in the US, it's much easier to deal with, right? So if somebody from China is either importing goods or manufacturing here in the US, we can easily go to court, assuming they have patent rights or trademark rights, something like that, and enforce those rights and get it stopped. In China, it's a lot more difficult. So, number one, I would want to work with local counsel there. And they have the boots on the ground. They can investigate. They're the ones who can go to court, see what's happening. But the first step is always finding the right local partner and having a thorough investigation done. I have a client who is half in the US, half in China. He manufactures in China. He spends, at least before the pandemic, he spent half his time in California and half his time in Shanghai. And even though he manufactures in China, employs a lot of Chinese people, has great sales in China, he had a problem with quote unquote gray market goods, where if his plant was operating, say, from 9 to 5 at night, his foreman was in there going in without his knowledge, using his same equipment to make the same goods and selling them under a different brand. Think about that. How do you tell those goods apart from the branded goods? Because it's the same equipment, same everything. So he had to go to court. He was able to get the foreman to stop. He was able to fire the foreman. So that source of the goods stopped. But then the foreman knew everything, had knowledge of how to make it, had knowledge of how to sell it and what it was supposed to look like, and went down 2 blocks away, started up again. Now it looked a little different because it was no longer on the same equipment, but he had an issue that, okay, so I now have to go to court and stop it again. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole over there sometimes in China. And that's why it's important to have a good investigator, be working with the right people to make sure that everything that can be done is done. I hear all the time that you can't enforce rights in China, and that's absolutely 100% not true. Chinese courts, the Chinese system, they are very aware of that perception. and they want to make it right. They want to make it different. The question is, once you enforce your rights, what do you do next? And how do you stop the next one and the next one? And that's why the constant vigilance, the constant investigation there is so key. Having somebody, not just in China, but local to wherever the issue is happening is so important. You know,
So
if anybody has an issue, I'm happy to help and talk with you and see what we can do to help. I have a lot of partners in China I work with.
that's good to know. Is there a point where the cost of policing and shutting down the thieves is more than the market, where you finally say, you know what, let them just do it, and we can't control that?
Yes, absolutely. There's a point. Luckily, none of the clients I work with have ever reached that point,
Mhm.
but I know competitors who have. The hope and the goal is to try to create such a nuisance for the competitors that it never gets there, right? That they see 2, 3, 4 times as soon as we start this activity somewhere else, they're coming after us. You know, maybe we move on to a different product or a different opportunity that's less of a hassle for us, that we don't have to worry so much about.
Got it. Alan, let me ask you a question. You're working with a foreign company as a fractional CFO, and their culture is entirely different. How do you communicate with them what you're doing and the importance of certain elements of being a CFO that maybe they don't understand? How do you communicate that?
Well, let me just say that I think the purpose of all business is to sell something at a certain price and buy it or make it at another price, and that's your business model. And there's nothing more important for a company to do than follow its business model. And I think it's the understanding the laws and regulations in this country or any other country that anybody goes to. You need the experts on the ground to actually help with those things, so you could really follow, so the company can follow its business model. I think in the end, you know, a business model coming from China, when you strip away all the other, you know, a lot of the extraneous factors, and a business model coming from Mexico or even in the United States, the business models aren't all that much different. So I think you can communicate because you're talking about a business model that's basically, when you strip everything away, it's basically not that much different than any other business model. But the laws and regulations, they are could be very, very different. The culture is very, very different. So that's why you need to bring in the professionals.
Okay. Bob, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer it, but I'm going to pose it anyway.
Okay.
So, are there particular countries that when they come into the U.S., they're more likely to succeed than others?
It depends on the category. I think obviously language, if it's an English-speaking country, that barrier is eliminated. So that's, you know, one hurdle that you can easily jump over. I think, you know, American consumers in particular are very interested in variety. You know, we're variety-seeking people. I think most people are, but Americans, I think, especially so. And so if you have a better mousetrap, to use a cliche, something that's demonstrably better, a better appliance, a better consumer product, something that fits an unmet need, something that is unique, distinctive, something that helps affirm a consumer in what they believe or how they feel about themselves, then I think the job is much easier, because those barriers are, you can either knock them down because culturally or language wise, that's not an issue, or consumers are responsive or receptive to something that you're doing that other competitors or companies aren't providing. So I think it's not so much, I think, a more or less likely to succeed kind of an issue, as much as are you tapping into the demand, right? And I think that's the piece that a lot of companies, even, companies in the US, I mean, I think a lot of us here in the US are, we take for granted the fact that our companies, our domestic companies especially, are really tuned in to what the customer is saying. They're listening all the time. They're creating products and services that are focused on things that consumers are telling them that they want, that they have this particular set of needs or these criteria. There's nothing out there that's like that, and all of a sudden somebody's invented it or starting to produce it. So I think a little bit to what Alan was saying, what is the purpose of a business, right? So, yes, it's to make money, but really the fundamental part of any business is to create a customer. And if you're not creating a customer, you don't have any profits, you don't have any sales, you don't have much. You have maybe things that you're pushing out, but it's probably a commodity. So if you're trying to do a good job of entering the United States, building a business here, and creating customers, then you need to have a customer-centric business model. You need to really think about what the customer is looking for, what their needs are, and then build and develop products around those needs. This famous expression, one of my favorite management consultant types, professor Peter Drucker, he said, all companies have two functions: innovation and marketing. And that's not to diss accounting or finance or IP, but if you really boil it down to the essential functions of any business, it's to create new products and services continually, and then to market those products and services effectively. So, if you're going to be clumsy and stupid, then yeah, you're not going to succeed. But if you're smart and you're sensitive to customer needs, you'll probably do okay.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else have a question? Okay, so once again, everybody's going to get a copy of the video, and the contact information for everybody will be on that. And I'd like to thank our panelists for a really great job. You guys were really, really good today. Thanks so much.